Hello, welcome to North Star Oasis. I'm your host, Jeff Williams. We're here for another jam-packed, action-filled information overload just for you. Today is January 19th, 2018, the last day of the conclusion of the first year of President Trump's administration. But we are not today doing a look back on the first year, unfortunately, as much as I know my producer wants us to. But we do have a lot of stuff that we do have to cover today, and it's kind of a somber day for us here today, and we'll get into that in just a moment. We're going to just go right off the bat to our to an important question, and that's a question I think just about everybody asks themselves at some point in time in their lives. Is there life after this life? Here's Dennis Prager with something for you to ponder.
Is there an afterlife? Life after this life ends? There probably isn't a human being who hasn't asked this question at one time or another. And here's the answer. If there is a God, there is an afterlife. It's that simple. And here's why. First, this life is filled with an immeasurable amount of injustice and suffering. The only way there can be some ultimate justice for victims of evil is if there is an afterlife. And the only way comfort is available to those who suffer unjustly, from painful disease and premature death to the death of a child, is if there is an afterlife. But such an afterlife exists only if there is a good and just God. A good and just God provides a way to compensate for all the unjust suffering in this world. Second, since God is not physical, the physical world is not the only reality. There is also a non-physical reality. And we humans have a part of us which, being non-physical, survives the death of our body. We call it the soul. But if there is no God, this physical life is all there is. So, no God, no soul, no afterlife. Now, of course, those who doubt God's existence have every reason to doubt an afterlife. But if you believe in a good God, then you have to believe there's an afterlife. If you say you believe in God but not in an afterlife, the God you believe in is not only not good, that God is cruel. That God made a world filled with unjust suffering and just left it at that. Now, some people who don't believe in an afterlife offer their own version of immortality. I once attended a funeral where the man officiating said, "While there is no afterlife, we do live on through our good works and in the memories of loved ones." That's what a lot of people who reject an afterlife want to believe. But the idea that human beings live on through their good works or through the memories of loved ones, which generally means a person's children or grandchildren, is simply meaningless. If people live on through their good works, then children who die don't live on. The number of good works most children are even capable of is minuscule. As for babies who die, well, babies can't engage in good works at all, so I guess they just don't live on. Anyway, the truth is that bad works usually live on longer than nearly any good works. In fact, if works make us immortal, Hitler, with all the evil he did, is far more immortal than the kindest people on earth. As for living on in the memories of our children, what do we say to those who have no children? Sorry, you don't live on. Moreover, living on in anyone's memory, as beautiful as that is not the same as immortality or an afterlife. As Woody Allen put it, I don't want to achieve immortality through my work. I want to achieve it through not dying. If there's no afterlife, we don't live on. Period. Let's be honest enough to acknowledge that. If there's no afterlife, none of us will ever again be with those we most love and who love us. If there's no afterlife, neither anyone murdered nor any murderer will ever receive ultimate justice. If there's no afterlife, this life, for the vast majority of people who ever lived, and for those alive now, is a meaningless crapshoot. Finally, people always ask me, so what happens in the afterlife? To which I can only respond, I don't know, but I do know this. My belief in God and the afterlife keeps me sane. The thought that this life is all there is means that torturers get away with the horrors they have engaged in. It means that this life is random and pointless. And it means that I will never again see anyone I love. This would drive me mad. In fact, I don't see how it wouldn't drive anyone mad who cares about suffering and who loves anyone. So is there an afterlife? If there is a God, of course there is. I'm Dennis Prager.
A year ago, at this time in January, my uncle, who had just turned 70 the previous November, ended up having a severe heart attack, and he had actually flatlined 4 times. He thankfully was revived. We had to interrupt the show, take a couple of weeks off. I had to go to Michigan and deal with family situation there. Again, he had recovered, he'd survived, but it was very, very tepid. He's doing fine today. He got more medical attention and ended up getting some devices implanted into his heart, and he's been under regular medical care, and things are turning around, and he's doing really well. But last year, we weren't sure. And then shortly after that, I was diagnosed with atrial fibrillation, which is actually pretty common. But on the heels of an uncle nearly passing away from a heart attack, to have atrial fibrillation yourself, that had me questioning my own mortality. Had me asking the question, even though I do know the answer, that yes, as a believing Christian, that I do believe in life after this life. But still, when you're dealing with personal medical issues, the mortality really takes on a different meaning. Thankfully, they found out mine was just due to a potassium imbalance, and once I got my potassium levels up to a normal level of balance, things are fine. And so I'm not going to, that I know of, I'm not going to drop dead in the middle of this show. But still, it's still, a very important question that a lot of people ask, and a year ago, that's the kind of stuff that we were dealing with right here on this show. But now, in the last week or 2 weeks, there have been some well-known political people in Minnesota who have passed away, and two of them whom I knew personally. And so we're going to actually start off with the first one, which is Sarah Janicek. She was the editor of the Politics in Minnesota newsletter and directory. She was a longtime Republican activist, lobbyist, and writer. She had passed away on, was it the 12th, January 12th, of severe septic infection in a hospital in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. And her loss, she was a very influential political commentator, writer, and strategist. And she was one, if there's anything about Sarah Janicek that she kind of passed on to me, was the ability to look at both sides of a political issue. What do the Republicans want? What do the Democrats want? And kind of try to find that balance in between. And those are things that I still take to heart. So we're going to take a look right now at a video where Sarah Janicek is being interviewed in August of 2008 regarding Tim Pawlenty. And this just to show a little bit about who Sarah was. And Brian Lambert, who used to write for the Pioneer Press, is the one interviewing her.
Brian Lambert for MSPMag.com. For our September issue, we asked 2 of the prominent local political watchers for their opposing views of Governor Tim Pawlenty, his administration, and his chances here in the fall campaign. With us now is Sarah Janicek, publisher of Politics in Minnesota. my erstwhile colleague from our short-lived radio
This is
station.
hard, Brian. You're interviewing me.
You took the view with in your article on Pawlenty that this guy is simply naturally gifted. Does this hold up really as you talk to the Republicans that you know and have dealt with over the years, Ron Abensteiner and such?
Absolutely. I mean, again, I've interviewed probably 500 people for the legislature who've become legislators, and Tim's resume, the governor's resume, is very similar to everybody else's. And he plotted a political career, and he had a couple of lucky breaks, but he worked his rear end off. And look where he is today.
At one point, he realized that after the famous campaign fine over the advertising, that he had to get kind of a tighter control over key political decisions. How much of this is he doing himself now?
I think he's doing almost all of it now. And again, for people who don't know, typically when someone becomes a statewide candidate or a congressional candidate, the candidate stays out of those decisions because it's just the candidate can't make good decisions. And in Pawlenty's case, he had staff who made terrible decisions. He had to bite the bullet to the tune of $600,000 out of a $2.2 million campaign. And so, in my view, and from the viewpoints of others I talked to for the story, he really makes all of the major decisions himself because he doesn't trust anyone else.
Well, and I think what I took away was that he also has the skills to pull this off, or it might overwhelm another politician.
Absolutely. I mean, he's a trained political operative, has done every job, including driving people. He drove John McCain when he was in law school. I think part of what drives him is if you work so hard to get where you are, a stupid political mistake is something you don't want to make. You've worked that hard, and
you learn from it when you do.
Learn from it, and so when other people made a bad mistake that could have tanked his career, I think that's when he made the conscious decision, not going to happen again.
Do you think he's been looking beyond the governor's mansion for the last few years?
I don't think so. It's just unfathomable to me that anyone can really grow up and think they can be vice president or president. I mean, it's a conversation I never had with him. The conversation always was run for senator. And then, of course, from the story, and as everyone knows, he ended up running for the governorship and won.
As I said, we shared a studio in our radio days, but this was a unique kind of turnabout as I got to play editor for your story. How was your experience being editor?
As an editor? Yeah. Do you remember I used the word BEG several times? The psychology of it is very tough for me, Brian. We used to be equals, and here you were slashing and burning my copy.
It was sweet to me.
It was horrible. But payback is, we all know what payback is.
Yes, it absolutely is. Thank you, Sarah. Brian Lambert for MSPMag.com.
Sarah Janicek, I first met her back in 1992. I've known her ever since. Again, great person. She passed away at the age of 57. And that's not the only person that passed away recently. Another one is Evie Axtell from Maplewood. I've known her since like 1990. Yeah, it was 1990s when I first met Evie. And she was the former Republican National Committee woman for Minnesota. And I'm trying to remember now how long she was on the National Committee. I want to say for like 13 years or something. I mean, maybe longer than that. From 1989 to 2011. And her husband was former Maplewood Mayor Les Axtell. When Les passed away a couple of years ago, we actually did a tribute on this show. One thing is with Evie that she looked and acted like a sweet grandmother. But I'll tell you this, she was one of the most fiercest political people I have ever met in my entire life. And you always wanted to stay on Evie's good side. You never wanted to cross her because she would slice you. And that's just the way she was. Politics is hard-nosed. Evie knew that. She helped write the rule book. And I think that Minnesota Republican Party was better off having Evie Axtell representing them at the National Committee. So it was quite an honor to know both Sarah and Evie over the years, and they will be missed. And Evie was 88 years old when she passed away. And the other person that passed away recently is Emily Ann Staples, or Tuttle Staples. She is also a former Republican and a former Democrat. She had been a member of the Republican Party but switched to the DFL in 1973, then ran as the DFL endorsed candidate for the House of Representatives the next year in the 74 election. She won a seat in the 76 election and was in the state Senate from 1977 to 80 as a DFLer, and then she also ran unsuccessfully for the lieutenant governor position under Mike Hatch's 1990 gubernatorial campaign, and she also was 88 years old. So we had 3 notable losses in Minnesota politics all within the last week. But moving on, we are also going to talk about yet another loss. And this one is actually, we've covered many episodes about the USS Oklahoma and its role at Pearl Harbor and the repatriation of the unknowns, the identification and repatriation of the unknowns. But in this case, Joe Triolo is a survivor of the USS Oklahoma, and he passed away just the other day. Let's roll the video.
It's a recognition and a memorial for Pearl Harbor survivors that are still active, and also for the survivors that are already gone. It's like paying respect to them. It means a lot to me, more than anything, the people that perished at Pearl. You follow me? I have a personal friend on the Oklahoma that went down with the ship. We were raised together. He followed me into the Navy. He stayed on the Oklahoma. I went to the Asiatic Station. He perished on the Oklahoma. And at the 90th anniversary, I went to Pearl Harbor looking for his grave. He has no grave. He was buried in a mass burial. The ship was recognized, but the individuals was not recognized. But I know he's there because they've listed him. I think what we're doing is trying to revive the people that have already gone momentarily. And the way you do that is you do that through the people that were there that are still alive. I think that's it right there.
Joseph John Triola passed away peacefully on January 11th. He was born in Wilkinson, West Virginia on March 3rd, 1920. Growing up in West Virginia, he was raised in a coal mine community, and after trying to work in the mines, he realized he wanted to do something else, so his dad gave him some money, and he ventured off to a recruiting office to join the United States Navy, and he passed away at the age of 97. March 3rd would have been his 98th birthday. We're going to actually look right now at another thing that we cover extensively is the U.S. space program, especially with NASA and the Apollo era. And we had lost 3 astronauts in the Apollo era in recent years. So we're going to take a look at a 1999 video with 3 members of the Apollo 12 crew, Dick Gordon, Alan Bean, and Pete Conrad. Pete Conrad passed away shortly after this video was made back in 1999, but Dick Gordon, who was the command module pilot, he passed away recently. Let's take a look at the video.
On July 24th, 1969, a date in human history largely forgotten, men from the moon first landed on planet Earth.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
The second, equally critical portion of John F. Kennedy's 1961 challenge had been realized. The Apollo 11 crew, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Michael Collins, had flown a near-perfect first mission to the moon. It would be a tough act to follow. These three astronauts were waiting to try: Charles Pete Conrad, Alan Bean, and Dick Gordon. 30 years later, the second crew to land on the moon got together to remember an electrifying launch, a pinpoint landing, and friendships forged in flight. Here are their memories of that intrepid voyage.
Roger, copy.
Central to any NASA mission was the flight director. Gerald Griffin, a former Air Force pilot, had the responsibility of shepherding Apollo 12's trip to the moon.
Mercury had just finished when I came to work for NASA, and we had already had the challenge to go to the moon. And if you really think about it, Gemini and Apollo were really kind of the same program. So was Mercury. It was all leading toward a lunar landing.
Training for the lunar trip was extensive and repetitive. Numerous flights on the aptly named Vomit Comet, a converted Boeing 707 which simulated weightlessness, gave the crew an opportunity to practice mission activities in near zero gravity. After months of training and countless simulations, launch time was finally at hand. On November 14, 1969, the crew of Apollo 12 sat atop the massive Saturn V, waiting for a go from the controllers.
1 star, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engines running. Commit. Liftoff. We have liftoff. 11:22 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. Pete Conrad reports the yacht program is in.
A few seconds after launch, 30, 40 seconds after launch, something happened.
40 seconds. Mark 1 Bravo.
This room, every light in here on these consoles went bright. There was red lights. Pete started talking to us that he saw all kinds of lights in the cockpit, warning lights.
Fuel cell lights and AC bus light, a fuel cell disconnect, AC bus overload 1 and 2, main bus A and B out. So I don't know what happened. I'm not sure we can get hit by lightning.
We had 11 electrical warning lights associated with the electrical panel, and in all our simulations and double failures and triple failures, they never figured out how to light all 11 of them at one time, but they were all on.
Later on, Al asked me why didn't I help him.
I
didn't help.
He wasn't quite as polite as he's saying right now.
I said, I didn't help you, Al, because I didn't know what the hell to do.
We learned a lot that day on Apollo 12.
We became the longest lightning rod in history.
So it was time to let Conrad and Company know that the translunar injection burn had been authorized and they were heading to the moon.
Apollo 12 Houston, the good word is your go for TLI. Hoopy-doo, we're ready.
His comments during the landing were Pete Conrad personified. And boy, we're coming right down with this baby, right down the middle. And
Pete, you know, hey, there it is. There it is. Son of a gun, right down the middle of the road. Outstanding. 42 degrees, Pete. Hey, it's started right from the center of the crater. Look out there. I can't believe it. Amazing.
And then his comment when he stepped off on the moon it was very similar. You know, where Neil had been very historical and Pete was very funny.
Down to the pad. Man, that may have been a small one for Neil, but that's a long one for me.
I was the smallest guy in the office, and I said nobody remembers what the second person said anyhow. And so, let alone who they are or anything. And so I said, well, I'll say it may have been a big one, a little one for Neil, but it was a big one for a small fella like me, and I think I left that small fella.
It wasn't long before Pete Conrad, now outside the LEM, could see they had realized a prime goal of the mission.
Oh, you'll never believe it. That's what I see sitting on the side of the crater. The old surveyor, huh? The old surveyor, yes, sir.
As time for leaving the moon drew near, Alan Bean began to be concerned the lone booster rocket beneath them might not operate when called upon.
I wasn't calm, and Pete looks over to me and says,
exhibits.
I hadn't been saying anything for a while. Pete looks over and says, is there anything worrying you or something? And I said, yeah, I'm kind of worried if they put this all together, you know, I mean, we're not going to be here. And then you, in order to calm my nerve, you say, what?
I said, don't worry about it. If it doesn't light, we'll become the first permanent monument to the U.S. space program on the moon.
That made me feel good.
3, 2, 1, lift off. And away we go. Positive power. Joy. We're on our way. And at 1 minute, go right 20 feet. Okay.
Now the only thing you got left is re-entry.
Re-entry, that's right.
It took about 6 minutes to enter. Dick was flying the
8 minutes.
8 minutes.
Re-enter.
I feel blessed every day. Feel lucky every single day. I just lucked out of all these people on Earth here. Here we are.
We've often been asked what we discovered when we went to the moon, and we seem to respond that we discovered the Earth.
Well, along with what Al had to say, I was lucky to fly 4.
Mm-hmm. Really?
And I think you guys said it pretty well. We're just lucky to be there.
We're lucky to be there.
10 days after this historic reunion, Pete Conrad was killed in a motorcycle accident near his home in California. He was 69. This program is dedicated to the memory of Charles P. Conrad. His love of flying and his fearless spirit combined to crystallize the image of the astronaut as a true American hero. He possessed a fierce loyalty to his crewmates, a deep love for his family, and an unmatched devotion to his country. He will always be remembered for his childlike joy in discovery on Earth and in the heavens.
So Dick Gordon, he was a Navy officer. He was retired at the rank of captain. He was an aviator, chemist, test pilot, and astronaut. One of only 24 people to have flown to the moon as the command module pilot for Apollo 12. So the other 2 actually were on the moon. That's one of the reasons why Dick Gordon didn't really speak much in that video. He was on the Gemini 11 and Apollo 12 missions. He spent 2 hours and 41 minutes in EVA, extravehicular activity, and he retired on January 1st, 1972. He was in the 3rd group of astronauts named by NASA in October of 1963, and then he had worked in the shuttle, astronaut office, and became the chief of advanced programs in 1971, and then he had worked on the design of the space shuttle. And also, after leaving NASA, Dick Gordon served as the executive vice president of the New Orleans Saints football team, a position which he held from 1972 to 1976. And he had passed away, by the way, November 6th at the age of 88. So there's 3 people now who had all passed away at age 88. We're going to also take a look now at, I like this story. It's something you don't hear all the time. We're going to actually take a look at Apollo, I believe, 14. With Bruce McCandless, who was a Capcom commander. He is talking about the night before Al Shepard made his space flight to the moon. Let's take a look.
I was on the support crew for Apollo 14. Al Shepard, Stu Roosa, Ed Mitchell, and one of my duties on the support crew was to configure switches in the command module the night before launch. That is, set everything up for the following morning and launch. And I did that and finished up, returned to the crew quarters about 10 p.m. and made myself a sandwich. Was sitting there having a sandwich and a glass of milk or something before going to bed, and just idly watching the closed circuit TV monitors of what was going on at the Cape. One of the cameras, the one that was being featured, was trained on the flame trench underneath the Saturn V on the launch pad. And what I did notice, though, was that shortly the white Corvette drove down into the flame trench right under the launch vehicle while it was still being fueled. This is something that never happens. But then I noticed that in the Corvette was Al Shepard, the commander for the mission the next day. And Al drove down right underneath the center engine of the Saturn V, sort of leaned back and looked up and stayed there for 2 or 3 minutes. And you could just tell that going through his mind was trying to appreciate what was going to happen the next day on his launch. And after 2 or 3 minutes, he put the Corvette in reverse, backed out of the flame trench. 15 minutes later, came into the crew quarters, said, "Good night, Bruce. Good night, Al." And he got up next morning and launched for the moon on Apollo 14.
Bruce McCandless was born June 8th, 1937, and he passed away December 21st at the age of 80. He was a Navy captain, had graduated from the Naval Academy, and he was selected in NASA Astronaut Group 5 in April of 1966. He was the youngest member of that group at age 28. And he was Mission Control Capsule Communicator, Capcom, for Apollo 11 during the first lunar moonwalk by Neil Armstrong. And then he also doubled as Capcom for Apollo 14, as I just mentioned. And he was also reassigned to the Skylab program, where he served his first crew training assignment as backup pilot for the space station's first manned mission alongside backup commander Rusty Schweikert and backup science pilot Story Musgrave. Following that assignment, he again served as Capcom on Skylabs 3 and 4, and was the co-investigator on the M509 astronaut maneuvering unit experiment that was flown on Skylab, and this eventually led to his collaboration on the development of the Manned Maneuvering Unit, the MMU, which was used during Space Shuttle EVAs. He had logged over 312 hours in space, including 4 hours of MMU time, and he was a mission specialist on shuttle flights 41B and 31. And because he was known for his work on the manned maneuvering units, he actually was the person to make the first untethered spacewalk. Let's take a look.
Roger, have a liftoff and the clock is operating.
By the mid-1960s, only a few short years into the space race between the United States and the Soviet Union, manned space flights had become somewhat pedestrian. And for agencies in both countries, driven by an impulse to up the ante, there was an itch to break through another barrier. In March of 1965, Russian cosmonaut Alexei Leonov left the confines of his spacecraft and became the first human to walk among the stars. For 12 minutes, on a 17.5-foot tether, he floated freely in the dark abyss. It was a monumental feat, but one that nearly cost him his life. Leonov's suit ballooned in the vacuum of space, making it impossible for him to fit through the airlock. With no other option, he opened a valve on his suit to depressurize, enough so he could re-enter the capsule. 3 months later, the Americans sent up their first spacewalker, NASA astronaut Ed White.
Okay, I'm separating from the spacecraft.
Tied to a tether, White gleefully hovered high above Earth's atmosphere.
I feel like $1 million.
White enjoyed it so much, he was reluctant to return to the spacecraft. But by the time he did, he'd outlasted his Russian counterpart by more than a few minutes.
And so a record-breaking, highly successful 20-minute walk in space.
To be sure, these walks in space were more than just shows of daring do. They were meant as preparations for an eventual landing on the moon. But once that mission was accomplished, the role of extravehicular activities evolved, made not so much for the purposes of testing endurance or maneuverability, but instead for conducting maintenance and repairs.
Tilt it up. Try that right there. Oh, okay. That looks as good as you're going to do. Okay.
The first EVA repairs were made during 1973's Skylab 2 mission, when astronauts ventured out to fix a stuck solar panel. But like the spacewalkers who came before them, they were tethered to their spacecraft, and it would be another decade before man would be free to soar unrestrained. The prospect of greater functionality outside of the spacecraft inspired NASA to develop the MMU, or Manned Maneuvering Unit. It would get its first test during the 10th Space Shuttle mission, STS-41B. On February 7, 1984, astronauts Bruce McCandless and Robert Stewart strapped in and began piloting away from the Space Shuttle Challenger. Propelled by tiny jets, they toured the vast expanse that surrounded them for nearly 6 hours. McCandless got as far away as 320 feet, and from the windows of the spacecraft he left, he looked like nothing more than a white speck.
Oh, this is really beautiful out here. We're getting a nice sun angle and everything.
It was the first untethered spacewalk, a milestone immortalized by this image of man flying far beyond the bounds of Earth. And not even 20 years removed from the death-defying endeavors of Leonov and White, it was yet more evidence of the rapid ingenuity fueled by the exploratory spirit so central to our human nature.
So, Bruce McCandless passed away at age 80. And, of course, that is not the last astronaut we're going to be discussing today, because kind of the dean of U.S. astronauts has also left us, and that would be astronaut John Young. He was actually one of the first astronauts that I never met him, but he was actually one of the first ones I had actually heard of and actually had watched a live, not in person but on TV, space flight, because he was the first person to pilot the space shuttle on STS-1 on April 12th, 1981. Yeah, and John Young, pull up his career here. He came to NASA in 1962 in the second astronaut group. He had replaced Tom Stafford as pilot of Gemini 3 when Alan Shepard, who was the original command pilot, was grounded due to Meniere's disease. He made his first manned flight of the Gemini spacecraft with Gus Grissom in 1965. Then he trained as a backup pilot for Gemini 6. He was on Gemini. He flew on Gemini 3, Gemini 10, Apollo 10, Apollo 16, Space Shuttle Flight 1, and Space Shuttle Flight 9, STS-9. So he has logged 34 days, 19 hours, and 39 minutes in space. He had 3 EVAs, 20 hours, 14 minutes, and 14 seconds in total duration. And he retired from the Navy at the rank of captain. And when he had left his, when he ceased becoming a astronaut, he actually had headed up the NASA astronaut office and retired in 2004, December 7th, 2004, announced his retirement December 7th, 2004. He retired on December 31st, 2004 at age 74, and then he had still continued attending the Monday morning meeting at the astronaut office at the Johnson Space Center for several years after that. And John Young passed away on January 5th, and he was 87. And let's take a look at the career of John Young.
The American astronaut John Young, who was one of just 12 men who have walked on the moon and who flew the first space shuttle mission, has died. He was 87. Young enjoyed the longest career of any space astronaut, serving NASA for 42 years. He went into space 6 times, including on the Apollo and Gemini missions. Well, earlier I spoke to Commander Chris Hadfield, former astronaut and commander of the International Space Station, who knew John personally.
He is perhaps the most experienced astronaut in all of history. He flew 6 times. He flew 4 different rocket ships. He was the first flight of Gemini. He did the first flight of the space shuttle, as you said. He walked on the moon. John was a fascinating, devoted, and passionate, and really fearless man, and just a role model to so many astronauts, and including the 6 people that are up at the space station right now. A life really well lived, and a good friend of mine.
As you say, a good friend, and you knew him personally, and there's so many lovely stories about him, including that he took a corned beef sandwich up on a flight.
On his very first flight, on the first flight of Gemini, actually, he realized, hey, we're just people, and there's nothing magic going on here, and we're going to get hungry, and he brought a corned beef sandwich with him, and he took some heat for it, but he went on to be the chief of the astronaut office longer than any other astronaut, and to have a career that all of us just marvel over. So it looks like NASA got over the corned beef sandwich eventually. But what an incredible guy. And he wasn't interested in the past. If you talk to him about what's going on in space, he wouldn't want to talk about his previous flights or having walked on the moon. He's interested in what's going on now. What are the upcoming moon missions? Where are we headed next? What are the problems we need to solve right now? He's just a forward-thinking individual right up until the last day.
So it sounds like he was still very involved in what NASA was doing. Was he still working on projects, as far as you know?
When John retired officially from NASA after 42 years in 2004, I think, the gift that we gave him from the astronaut office was a permanent access badge to come to the Johnson Space Center, to come into any meeting he ever wanted to come to lend both his expertise but also his engineering acumen. And John would come into meetings for years afterwards as a retired person, just because not only was he interested, but he had so much to contribute. Of course, he was 87 when he passed away, and age catches up with us all. But John, he was as much a part of the space program as anybody has ever been.
I know you say that he was very forward-looking, but how did he view his legacy? Did he ever talk to you about that?
He wasn't the type of guy to talk about legacy, but he wrote a book, and in it he talked about the fact that he was just so happy to have had all this opportunity, and given the chance to change anything, he would do it all again the same way. He would have brought the corned beef sandwich again too, I think. But huge risks. When we flew the space shuttle, we had never flown that rocket before. The first time we ever tried that rocket, he and Bob Crippen were on board.
We do seem to be...
a really complex risk to sign up to.
We do seem to be losing a generation of these astronauts that were pioneers. How do you think that he will be viewed by the next generation of astronauts? Do you think he will continue to inspire them?
Oh, sure. He's a historic figure. He was legend when I was hired as an astronaut 25 years ago. He'll continue to be legend. But the most experienced American astronaut now is Peggy Whitson. She's got all the records. And there are 6 people up on the space station right now. And we have the biggest rocket that exists in the world is launching at the end of this month. The Chinese are landing on the moon with a small robot rover later this year. So is the Indian Space Agency. And all of that is built on the legacy of the people that have gone before. John would be very proud of all the work he'd done, but much more interested in what's happening this year and how are we going to take advantage of everything we've learned and how can we turn that back to be useful to understanding the Earth itself. John was just as passionate as he could be about it all and just gave his all to contribute to make all this stuff happen.
As forward-looking as a man that he sounds like he was, it must be quite sad, though, for the community to be losing more and more of these men who were the first to walk on the moon.
Oh, I don't think the fact that they've reached the end of their natural lives diminishes anything. There's, of course, grief and sadness. When we went on vacation, John would take care of our dog. He was a lovely guy. But I think we are just immensely proud of what each of the astronauts and all of the engineers and people that work in the space business have been able to accomplish. When I was born, no one had ever flown in space. All of this is less than even my lifetime. So there's still a great newness to it and a great delight and inspiration that comes from it. And John is one of those stars of the past that people will look at and wonder as they're trying to decide, what could I contribute? How could I be part of this? How can I make myself somebody like that?
That was Commander Chris Hadfield, who's a former astronaut and former commander of the International Space Station, talking about his friend, the astronaut John Young, who has died at the age of 87.
So astronaut John Young has passed away at age 87. So we are now losing the Apollo generation. If you were watching this show last summer, you probably recall my delight when I was at the EAA AirVenture in Oshkosh for their salute to Apollo, because this is when some of the Apollo astronauts and one of the flight controllers was there. We did a whole show of it. By the way, our shows are available on Facebook, facebook.com/NorthStarOasis, and youtube.com/NorthStarOasis. And check out our program in August when we had covered the salute to Apollo. You know, these are the guys that I looked up to in my youth. And I know that there are a lot of other people of my age bracket in the mid-40s who also looked up to these people. They were our heroes when we were children. And they're still heroes in our eyes, even as adults. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to make sure that we paid our proper respect to astronauts John Young, Bruce McCandless, and Dick Gordon. Because for one final time, they at least earned that respect by what they had done so long ago. But speaking of NASA, January 27th, 1967, we lost 3 astronauts, Grissom, White, and Chaffee, Roger Chaffee, Ed White, Gus Grissom, on a launch pad fire on Apollo 1. January 28th, 1986, we lost 7 astronauts when the Space Shuttle Challenger exploded. And then February 1st, 2003, we lost another 7 astronauts when the Space Shuttle Columbia had broken apart on re-entry over Texas. So next week, well, about 10 days from now, we will be having NASA's Remembrance Day, or their Memorial Day. So I think it's fitting that at this point in time we actually pay our tribute to the fallen astronauts. And we're going to show you 2 videos. We're going to play them back to back. And it's of NASA's Day of Remembrance. This is from last year because this year's hasn't hit yet. So this is the 2017 tribute to the astronauts, the fallen astronauts.
We remember these as heroes of our space exploration program, but we also recognize these were mothers, fathers, brothers, sisters, sons, daughters. For us, they exemplify the pioneering spirit that helped to get us where we are today, and we'll build off that spirit as we continue to push humans further and further into space. They will not be forgotten. Godspeed, Apollo 1, Challenger, Columbia, and all the members of our family who have fallen in the line of duty for us here at NASA.
I cannot believe that it has been 50 years since I lost my father, along with his Apollo 1 crewmates, Gus and Ed. Although on that January day they lost their lives right across the river at Complex 34 on Cape Canaveral Air Force Station, Their story certainly did not end there, and their legacy lives on today. I'm so proud to be here today with all of you to pay tribute to my father, his crewmates, and the other fallen astronauts memorialized on the Space Mirror.
Deke picked Gus, Ed, and Roger. As usual, he knew what he was doing. Thank you, Deke. And to each of you who knew these three men so well, thank you for your sacrifices. The Apollo crew was magnificent.
When you look, NASA remembers, and so do we here at North Star Oasis. Yes, we also remember. Now, I don't want to leave this necessarily on a tragic note, because there's actually some hope. The families of the 7 Challenger astronauts who lost their lives on that tragic day in January of 1986 got together to keep a certain mission alive. That flight, as most people know, had the first teacher in space astronaut, Christa McAuliffe, on that flight. She was supposed to set up teaching lessons from space. That was the Educator in Space program. And the families decided to keep that mission alive. And they founded what's called the Challenger Learning Center. And they started the first one out in D.C. This is actually a big initiative of Commander Dick Scobie's wife, June Scobie Rogers. She had since remarried. And they have built a network of about 50 Challenger Learning Centers worldwide. There's about 30 to 34 of them in the United States. Unfortunately, there's not one in the Midwestern area. But they have done a lot in promoting STEM education, science, technology, I can't remember what E is, probably environment and math, engineering and math. They've done a great job in promoting and inspiring youth and giving them a support network in order to facilitate their ability to see outside of their local horizons and into something greater than themselves, kind of breeding the next generation of scientists and astronauts. So we're going to take a look right now at a quick video called What If Becomes What's Next by the Challenger Learning Center.
When you look into their eyes, you begin to remember some things about joy and sorrow, and even about yourself. You remember that what endures is truth. What counts is integrity. And the first step for everything is the belief it can be done. What if becomes what's next. And wisdom lives between Why? And why not? We celebrate curiosity, and we honor all those who encourage and support it. And if you want to find where excitement lives, where exploration is the name of the game, and where the spirit of adventure thrives, come here. The Challenger Center for Space Science Education. Dick Scobie, Mike Smith, Judy Resnick, El Onizuka, Greg Jarvis, Ron McNair, Krista McAuliffe. What could possibly be a more fitting tribute to character, determination, and strength? To the family members who work to continue their mission. Today, there are over 50 Challenger Learning Centers across Canada, the UK, and the United States, and there are many more on the horizon. Collectively, they reach almost 500,000 students each year. Using math, science, and technology, these girls and boys learn how to solve problems, make decisions, communicate with one another, and work as a team. When you look into their eyes, you begin to remember some things. The joy of learning and exploring. The profound belief that sorrow gives birth to hope. And the sure knowledge that though they may journey far, they will not lose sight of home. They will remember this time and this place, and they will inspire those who will follow.
I encourage everybody to go over to challenger.org, take a look at their programs, and consider throwing a few bucks their way if you feel so inclined. They do a great job. I really do wish we had one here in Minnesota, or at least in the upper Midwest. The nearest Challenger Learning Center is, I believe, in, I think, Aurora, Illinois. I actually just looked at this the other day. So I do know that there's like one or two in the Chicago area, but that's about it. There isn't one in Wisconsin. There isn't one in Minnesota. There have been attempts at trying to get one here in Minnesota, but nothing has come to date. Nothing in Iowa, nothing in the Dakotas, nothing in Upper Michigan. But they're still teaching kids throughout the rest of the country. I actually visited one in Maryland about 10 years ago, and they do a great job. And again, I really wish we had one here. Biggest thing is we go back to legacy. What's the legacy? How do you know, is there life after your life or this life? And for the families of the Challenger, the legacy moves on through inspiring and teaching the next generation. Since 4 of the people we discussed today were in the U.S. Navy, we're going to close today with the U.S. Navy Band with the Navy Hymn. I'm your host, Jeff Williams, reminding you that there's 339 shopping days left until Christmas. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next week.